Okay, so you turn on the news, and that tension in the Middle East, it just feels, well, you can feel it, right?
Cool, absolutely.
These headlines are constantly shifting. Strikes, counterstrikes, this back and forth between Iran and Israel.
Yeah.
It's incredibly complex, and honestly, it feels incredibly dangerous.
It really does. And that's exactly what we're, diving into today. We're drawing directly from this stack of sources you've given us, articles, research papers, notes. And they offer a really deep look into this intensifying rivalry, Iran and Israel. It's got these deep historical roots, but it's playing out in very immediate, frankly, very worrying ways right now.
So our mission here is pretty straightforward. We want to go through these sources you've shared, pull out the key insights, and help you understand what's actually going on beneath those headlines.
Exactly.
We'll unpack the history, that hidden world of cyber warfare, the nuclear dimension, which is huge, how these latest events fit in, and what different ideas for what happens next come out of this material.
Consider it your shortcut to getting up to speed on a really critical global flashpoint.
Yeah, a shortcut. I like that.
And there's probably no better place to start than with those recent headlines, the events that have just escalated things so dramatically.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Your sources really spotlight a major event on June 15th, 2025. Reports you included say that's when Israel launched a pretty big series of strikes against Iran.
That's right. The sources we looked at describe these strikes as targeting Iranian nuclear and military sites, and across multiple locations inside Iran, too.
Which locations?
Well, we're talking places like Tehran, Natanz, Parchin, the Kandab reactor, a ballistic missile site near Kermanshah, and Tabriz as well.
Wow, that's widespread.
Yeah.
And some of the claims detailed in your sources are, well, they're pretty striking. One report citing the Israeli military suggests these strikes were incredibly effective.
Yeah.
Claiming key Iranian leaders, even nuclear scientists, were killed.
Yes, that was a notable detail in one source. It actually named figures like Mohammad Bagheri, Gholam Ali Rashid, Hossein Salami, Ali Shamkhani. And according to that specific source, this stated goal wasn't just, a temporary hit. It was aimed at a longer-term setback for Iran's programs.
How so?
By taking out critical infrastructure and vital expertise. People.
Right, the people. So what was the specific justification Israel reportedly gave? Why launch these strikes now, according to the sources?
One source, citing the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, gives a very pointed reason. They claimed intelligence showed Iran's nuclear program was, quote, approaching the point of no return.
Point of no return.
Yeah, making concrete progress on weapon components and pushing forward with a secret plan, even while talks were supposedly happening.
So the assessment was urgent.
Apparently, according to that report, the assessment was Iran could get to weapons-grade capability within a short period.
Okay, so that's the Israeli rationale as reported. How did Iran respond initially? What did the sources say?
Iran reportedly launched counterstrikes, mostly involving drones, though the initial details in the sources were a bit limited. Iran's foreign minister was quoted saying their actions were purely self-defense and would stop if, the foreign aggression stopped. There were also reports of attacks hitting defense ministry facilities and some oil sites, including an incident at the Isfahan oil refinery. Though it's worth noting, Iran officially denied the refinery incident specifically.
Right. And here's where it gets, really interesting and maybe highlights just how confusing the intelligence picture can be. One of your sources points out this huge contrast.
Which is?
Before these Israeli strikes happened, both U.S. intelligence and the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, the global nuclear watchdog, had consistently stated that Iran was not actively developing a nuclear weapon.
That discrepancy is absolutely critical, isn't it?
Yeah.
It immediately makes you question the intelligence assessments driving these massive decisions on different sides.
Totally.
And that same source also noted something about timing, that maybe the Israeli strikes were influenced by the IAEA saying Iran wasn't compliant with the NPT anymore.
The Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Right, and maybe the expiration of a deadline for a nuclear deal, plus perhaps a closing military window of opportunity. Lots of factors potentially at play.
So you've got Israel claiming Iran's on the verge, launching these big strikes. And then you have sources pointing to prior U.S. and IAEA assessments saying, well, actually, no.
Exactly.
It just shows how hard it is to really know what's going on based on the material you shared.
Precisely. And, as these sources also make very clear, while these recent events are dramatic, this whole situation didn't just pop up out of nowhere. This conflict has a long history.
Okay, let's step back then. The sources trace this state-level hostility way back, right? specifically to the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
That's the key turning point mentioned. After that, Iran cut ties with Israel, started viewing it as an enemy of Islam.
And it's not just state versus state, is it? The sources describe it more as what was the term? A proxy conflict.
That's a really key term they use.
What does that mean here, based on the material?
It means Iran supports various armed groups, non-state actors, around the region. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon,
Right.
Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Palestine, other groups in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen. These are sometimes called the resistance front in some of the sources.
Okay, so Iran supports them. And on the other side?
On the flip side, Israel has reportedly backed Iranian opposition groups, conducted military strikes against Iran's allies, especially in Syria, and has been linked pretty strongly in some reports to assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists.
So they're fighting through these other groups.
Yeah.
But the sources also say it's been escalating beyond proxies, yeah?
Yes, the material suggests direct clashes between Israeli and Iranian forces, particularly in Syria, started around 2018. So moving beyond just hitting the proxies.
And then, of course, 2024, 2025. That's a huge jump.
A significant leap, yeah, towards more direct, potentially state-on-state conflict.
And there's another layer here highlighted in your sources, one that often flies under the radar: cyber warfare.
Oh, yeah. This has been going on for, at least a decade? That's what the sources say?
Yeah.
Both sides launching pretty sophisticated attacks.
Targeting what?
Civilian infrastructure, government networks, security systems. It's a sort of persistent lower-level conflict, but it can have very real-world effects.
The Stuxnet attack back in 2010 on Iran's nuclear stuff that's mentioned as a big moment, right?
Definitely. Kind of a landmark event. It really showed how digital attacks could cause actual physical damage to critical systems.
And the sources say this cyber stuff has surged since October 7th.
Confirmed. It's become an even bigger tool for both sides, trying to weaken each other, compete for influence. It's like another battlefield in their bigger rivalry.
Speaking of that rivalry, the sources also try to analyze it using some big international relations theories.
They do. Realism comes up.
Okay, remind us.
That's the idea that states basically prioritize their own power and national interest above everything else. They operate in this kind of chaotic international system, so conflict is often seen as inevitable as they compete for security.
Got it. And the other one?
Hegemony.
Yeah.
The idea that states are basically vying for dominance, trying to be the top dog in the region, usually through things like military power and tech strength.
So the idea is that these proxy fights, the cyber attacks, the direct strikes, they're all just different ways this competition for power plays out, according to these theories.
That's exactly how some sources frame it. The cyber war, for instance, isn't just random hacking. It's described as a tool in that strategic competition for regional hegemony, a way to project power and mess with your rivals without necessarily starting an all-out war.
It does give you a way to connect the dots between actions that might seem unrelated. Okay, let's circle back to the nuclear issue, because that was clearly central to these recent strikes.
Absolutely. Targeting Natanz, Parchin, Kondab, those specific sites strongly suggest the goal was more than just a temporary pause.
Right.
The sources indicate the aim is a longer-term disruption, degrading key facilities, yes, but also taking out that specialized knowledge, the key people.
But here's a big question the sources raise. Can Israel actually eliminate Iran's nuclear program completely with strikes like these? Unilaterally.
Yeah, that's a critical point they bring up. The material suggests complete elimination is probably very, very difficult, especially those hardened sites or the ones buried deep underground like Fordo.
Fordo, right.
Successfully hitting places like that might need capabilities maybe only the U.S. has, like those specialized bunker-busting bombs, the massive ordnance penetrators.
Which naturally brings the U.S. role right into the spotlight.
Yep.
How do the sources describe the U.S. position, U.S. policy in all this?
Well, the Biden administration initially was pushing for a more integrated Middle East, but then the conflicts after October 7th happened, and the focus shifted pretty significantly.
To what?
Prioritizing Israel's defense, deterring Iran and its network of allies. The U.S. also kept pushing for normalization deals between Israel and Arab states, though some Arab states have tied that progress to the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
And the sources you shared, they offer different takes on whether U.S. policy has been effective or wise here.
Definitely distinct viewpoints presented. One perspective really emphasizes strong U.S. support for Israel. It argues Washington needs to be crystal clear about its commitment to defending Arab partners from Iran, and maybe even providing decisive support to Israel to stop things from escalating further.
That view also looks ahead a bit, doesn't it?
It does. It mentions figures linked to a potential incoming Trump administration expecting a return to maximum pressure policies against Iran.
Maximum pressure, okay.
But it's complex. That same perspective notes that former President Trump himself has sometimes shown he's open to talking, maybe making a deal with Iran. So even within that view, it's not totally black and white.
And then there's that other view from the Middle East Policy Council author you included, a very different analysis of U.S. policy.
Yeah, quite different. That source argues the Biden administration deciding not to jump into the Israeli retaliatory attack was actually smart. But more broadly, this perspective argues that decades of U.S. policy based on, quote, sanctions, pressure, and destruction might have actually been counterproductive.
Counterproductive how, according to that source?
The argument is that these policies might have unintentionally helped strengthen that resistance front we talked about, and maybe pushed Iran closer to Eastern powers, like China and Russia. And crucially, this view argues that military attacks, like the recent ones, could have the unintended effect of pushing Iran towards deciding to build a nuclear weapon, not stopping them.
Wow, that's a really critical counterargument in the material, isn't it? That pressure and military action could actually speed up the very thing they're trying to prevent.
Exactly.
It really highlights the different ways the experts in your sources are thinking about what drives this conflict and what the consequences might be.
It shows there's deep disagreement on the best strategy for dealing with Iran and trying to find stability in the region.
So let's try to bring this all together. The history, the strikes, the nuclear factor, these different U.S. policy views. What are the immediate consequences and the potential paths forward that come up in these sources?
Well, immediately after the strikes, one source pointed to market reactions. Equities dipped a bit, global oil prices went up, reversing a trend that had been helping ease inflation. So real economic ripples.
And the biggest worry, obviously, is this risk of a wider war.
Absolutely. That's the nightmare scenario. The sources warn that if this thing escalates further, especially if the U.S. gets directly involved militarily, Iran and its proxies would likely hit back hard, targeting Israel, targeting U.S. bases across the region.
Yeah.
That's what analysts are really watching for.
What about Iran's nuclear ambitions specifically? Do the sources think these strikes will actually end them?
Highly unlikely is the general sense from the material. The impact really depends on a lot of things. Like how successful were the strikes really in degrading capability? What's the international reaction? Does Iran gain sympathy or support? What are the broader regional politics doing? And one source flat out says, historically, these kinds of counterproliferation strikes have a really mixed record. Sometimes they can even increase a country's determination to get the bomb.
Right, that unintended consequence again. So, given all that, what paths forward, what potential solutions are discussed in these sources? How do we de-escalate this?
Well, there's a whole range of ideas reflecting how complex it is. Diplomacy and negotiation come up a lot.
Like what kind of talks?
Potentially restarting nuclear talks with the E3, that's France, Germany, UK, plus the US. Maybe even direct US-Iran talks, some suggest.
Okay.
What else? Stopping the military action is key. That's Iran's stated condition for halting its response, but it's also linked in some sources to calls for a ceasefire in Gaza as a necessary step to lower the temperature overall.
International mediation.
Suggested, yeah. Russia was mentioned as a potential player given its ties with both sides. Also, a focus on international law, the UN Charter, and the need for progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict via a two-state solution that comes up in one source, too.
Anything else? Regional approaches?
Yeah, exploring some kind of regional security cooperation, maybe among the Persian Gulf states. And addressing the root causes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is often cited, but also calls for broader WMD disarmament across the whole Middle East. And the experts quoted in the sources keep stressing, understanding each other's perspective, keeping diplomatic channels open to avoid miscalculation. Misunderstandings have fueled crises before.
And one source kind of zooms out even further, right?
Yeah.
Placing this in a global context.
Yeah, saying the whole global nuclear order is maybe at its weakest point since the early Cold War. Arsenals are rising, arms control agreements are weakening. It's a worrying backdrop.
And just one more thing, the reaction inside Iran. How did the public react, according to the sources?
One source described the Iranian public as angered and shaken by the strikes. And interestingly, directing anger not just at Israel, but also at their own leaders
Why?
for failing to protect them and for the country's isolation internationally. That source suggested people want change, but not through more violence or bloodshed.
That adds a really crucial internal dynamic to think about, alongside everything else.
It really does.
Okay. So we've taken a pretty deep dive into the sources you provided. We've walked through that long history of rivalry, the really traumatic recent escalation with these major strikes, the critical and very complex nuclear angle, the different perspectives on the U.S. role that were presented in the material, and this whole range of potential consequences and proposed ways forward that the experts and analysis you shared put on the table.
And yeah, all of this info drawn directly from those articles, that research, the notes you curated for this deep dive.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with, something provocative based on these core tensions and the different analyses we've seen throughout these sources. Does that strategy of maximum pressure, military action, the one advocated in some perspectives, does it truly contain a perceived threat, like Iran's nuclear program, or its regional influence? Or, as other analyses in your sources suggest, does it actually risk fueling the fire, creating significant unintended consequences, maybe pushing adversaries closer together and perhaps even speeding up the very programs it's trying to prevent?
It really raises that fundamental question, doesn't it? About what's the most effective path, the most sustainable path towards stability in a region that's already facing so many incredibly complex challenges.